I'm Mike Allen, co-founder of Axios. We're going to be talking today with Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, about why young people are so mad about AI booing at commencements and what the opportunities are, where the job growth will be. Brad, you're out with a very interesting blog post about AI jobs and the next generation, and you don't duck it. In paragraph 2, you say at commencement addresses, when AI is raised, it gets booed. Why is that?
Well, I think students, graduates have real concerns about what AI means for their future. They have grown up in an extraordinary time. I mean, the people graduating from college this year had to go to high school during COVID. So socializing through a screen, that was hard. Yeah, they've dealt with climate concerns, geopolitical uncertainty, trade tensions, you name it. Now they finally get to enter the workforce, and here comes AI. And they see the hiring trends, and I think there's a lot of different factors that are coming together. But I think too often this is being presented to them as something that is going to happen to them, not for them. And I think this is their way of saying, wait a second, not so fast. We have a voice. We want to be heard.
And something I wanted to ask you was whether the AI companies made a mistake by being so upfront about the danger to white-collar jobs posed by AI.
Entry-level white-collar work, I worry that those things are going to be first augmented, but before long, replaced by AI systems.
I personally think that this is going to unfold over 25 years, not 2.5. But look, if you're trying to raise money, as entrepreneurs need to do, it's easier to raise money if people think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. But we spend a lot of time studying the history of technology. 25 years for complete sort of transformation of an economy would be a record setter. So we start by saying nobody knows for sure, but let's not panic. Let's be thoughtful. And then let's think about how we create the future we want to create, one where we know that there will be transformation. There will be jobs that get displaced, that go away. There always are. We know there will be new jobs. We know this is going to change the nature of work. Let's figure out how to use it for the better so that it serves people, and let's be practical about it. And I think what has been missing, is that aspect. It's been too focused in my view, on sort of grandiose predictions and not centered enough in let's use technology as we always have to help people do better things. I think tech leaders in my years across the industry tend to repeat two mistakes. One is they overestimate the impact of technology, especially the pace at which it will arrive. And second, the tech leaders often underestimate people. The amazing thing about technology, I think about every discovery in history, it creates a stronger foundation. Human capability is neither fixed nor finite. Discoveries enable people to stand taller, to reach higher. As I said, there was a time when humanity discovered that a horse could run faster than a person, so people learned how to ride horses. Let's use AI to help people do more and not replace us.
So, Brad, do you think that the industry, some of the leaders who are making these predictions that AI was going to automate away white-collar jobs, do you think that they were too realistic, too pessimistic, or too honest?
I think they were not realistic, in my own view. I think it's another case of people overestimating the impact of technology and overestimating the pace at which technology gets diffused and changes every part of an economy. If you look at people who make technology predictions for a living, I might argue it's sort of an easy way to make a living if you can get into that job category, because you can wake up every morning and tell people about the future, and there's not a whole lot of accountability if 10 years later, your prediction turns out to be wrong. And in fact, you find that the same folks who made the wrong predictions a decade ago keep making them with extraordinary conviction. And it makes great fodder for people who generate news stories for a living. But let's remember, nobody has a crystal ball. Let's decide what kind of future we want to create, and then let's act with determination to create it.
Thank you for watching Behind the Curtain. We're going to pause for a message from Accenture and CEO Julie Sweet. We thank Accenture for making these conversations possible.
I'm very excited about our reinvention story today, which is literally 160 years in the making.
The reinvention was trying to bring a company into the trends of the future.
What is there to be learned from this big thumbs down from this generation?
Well, I would say two things. First, whenever you have people who disagree with you, you can have one of two reactions. You can say, these people are just wrong. They don't understand this. If they knew what we knew, they would like what we're doing. The alternative is to say, maybe they have a point. Maybe there's something we need to learn. And at Microsoft, frankly, we always take the second approach because we tried the first approach in the 1990s and the company was almost broken up. So for 25 years, every time we run into these kinds of reactions, we always pause and ask, what is it that we can learn? And I think what there is to be learned here is not just about technology. It's about people. We are in this conversation nationally that got started on almost a little bit of a runaway basis. Is AI going to take away all the jobs? And I think the reaction we should need to, in part, reflect upon is we should not allow that to happen. We need a future where work gives people purpose. It gives people dignity. And basically, as a company that has spent 51 years now creating productivity tools for people who work, if we're not helping people use technology to do better work, to get better jobs, then, as I said in the blog, really to my colleagues at Microsoft, then we are not doing the job we were born to do. So let's step back and think a lot more broadly about all this.
Jim and I have written at Axios that if AI were a political candidate, it would be getting crushed. Do you see the popularity of AI turning around? And if not, what do you and other big companies do about that?
Well, look, the number one thing we need to do is make AI work for people. We need to recognize here in the United States, the American dream, in the minds of many, is at stake. It's always stood not just for a better job and more economic opportunity, but work that gives you purpose, dignity, agency for people. So the first thing we have to do is recognize if we're not in the business of advancing the American dream, then there is, frankly, no reason that the American public should support what we're doing. Let's be clear about that. So let's get to work to make sure that we're working to create products that enable people to do more in their lives. Let's work to provide access to broader training ourselves. Let's work with employers to help them train people. And let's make sure we're contributing to an economy that is healthy across the board. We can't have healthy employment. We can't have great jobs for people if we don't have healthy companies in every part of the economy. So how do we do that? What's at stake with AI? Well, I think the risk is that as organizations use AI, they may find their know-how, their intellectual property leaking from their four walls, so to speak, to an AI company that uses it to, say, train a model, and then everything that was really unique about their own judgment is lost. It doesn't need to be that way. I would argue we can't afford it to happen that way. And what we need to think about first in our industry is how we create opportunities. This is where we're focused at Microsoft, so that organizations can use AI but retain their intellectual property within their organization and not lose it. And then more broadly, we need to start thinking about what are the What's a Bill of Rights for enterprises look like? What is it that people need? What do employees need to ensure that they can benefit with AI without losing control of their own creations, especially if, say, you're an entrepreneur? I think this is going to be a very important part of the conversation ahead of us.
There have been a lot of tech layoffs. Microsoft had a big layoff last year. How much of these white-collar cuts are really AI, and how much of it is more being used to clean up from COVID growth?
Well, I think you have multiple factors, and every industry is a little bit different. Certainly in the tech sector in the United States, you've got two factors that are probably the most important. First, the industry overhired between 2020 and 23. And you look back and you sort of ask, what were we all thinking? There was just this euphoria. The fact that you could sort of hire people anywhere in the world, have them all work remotely. There was this competition for talent. And the reality is we overhired. And so now we're contracting to get back to what it would be a more sensible normal. The second is you have this enormous capital expenditure. AI costs a lot of money. Infrastructure, it's huge. So that's putting more pressure on how we spend our money. And so we're having to rein in hiring or just employment levels. You put those two things together and you probably account for most of it. Yes, there are areas where we're looking to AI to drive productivity growth. And we are seeing some initial steps in that direction. I think most people look at something like call centers and think, you know what, I'll bet there'll be fewer jobs in those call centers in the future. I think the jobs that exist will be more interesting and satisfying jobs. We're already finding that. But right now, I would say mostly it's the first two factors, not the third.
You have two young people who are early career. My nieces and nephews are early career. What are the areas of growth? What are the areas of opportunity for people in their 20s, 30s?
Well, my advice to my kids and my advice as I put in the blog is, look, I think people should do what they have long done. Pick a field that is important to you, important to the world. Master the subject matter the way you would have before. But now, in addition to that, figure out how to use AI. Use AI to make your work more impactful. And that's what I see my two kids doing. One of them in particular does public policy analysis. So an classic inside the beltway kind of job.
That was in the genes, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can take that example and apply it across the board. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Learn and think about how you can use AI to do what you love and do it better. And then it's up to us as employers, as citizens, as people who might play a role, say if you're connected to a government. We need to give people the access to not just the technology, but the tools and the learning. We need to help people master this and not just leave people to figure it out by themselves.
What's an area of study or an occupation that was popular a year ago that now, based on what you know about AI, you would steer clear of?
Well, I would actually just look at every job and ask the same question. And I'm not the one who came up with this. Ryan Roslansky, and one of our fellows who was leading LinkedIn for a number of years, he and his colleague wrote a book called Open to Work. It came out a few months ago. They have a great framework. They said, look at your job and recognize you may think it's a title, but really it's a bundle of tasks. Write down sort of what the tasks are that you do on a regular basis, and then put them into three buckets. The first bucket is things that you think AI can do by itself. It can automate those tasks. The second bucket is tasks that you do that you can do better with AI. And the third bucket is things that are just distinctly human. So let me just take being a lawyer, something that I started out in Washington, D.C., 40 years ago doing. There's a lot that's been automated over the last 40 years. But like right now, an entry-level lawyer 2 years ago, 3 years ago, might be reading documents and writing summaries. AI can do that very well. If that's the only thing that you're doing, if you're like a paralegal, wow, I'd say that is not going to have a bright future. But then you go to the second bucket, things that lawyers can do and do better with AI. I want to come up with better arguments to represent my client in a courtroom, or I want to find new ways to approach a contract. Use AI to help, but then add your own creativity on top. And then third, think of the things that will always be uniquely and solely human. Going into a courtroom and standing up before a judge, sitting across the negotiating table and winning the trust of a potential business partner. Think about where human skills will, I believe, always be indispensable. Use AI to do the things that AI can do. Make yourself better with the rest.
AI leaders are very prolific, 12-page memos, 13-page memos. I've been at this 30 years. I've never covered an industry that was so eager to be regulated. Why are AI companies so hungry to be regulated?
Well, I think there's two things. There's a good intent here, and I'll just say there are some patterns that we should be a little more circumspect about. I think that there are some really terrific people in the AI sector that recognize the issues, and they know that government needs to play a role, that laissez-faire AI is not going to be a solution. And I think that's a good trend, and we should build on it. But I do think that there's another piece that is especially important, I'll say, inside the Beltway, but across the country. Just think about the social media debates when we started seeing them about a decade ago. Look, you had some companies that said, we want legislation, and then they basically opposed every bill in Congress because they never liked it specifically. What I think we should be very circumspect about are ideas that are so grandiose that the chance of them being adopted is zero. If somebody says, this technology is so powerful that we need a global treaty to slow it down, then I would say, then take your foot off the accelerator yourself if you think it's moving too fast. The prospect of a global treaty this decade is non-existent. The notion that we'll see all wealth consolidated into a few companies who will somehow work with the government to send a paycheck to everybody while they're sitting on a beach, that is not a vision of the future that I believe has any real prospect of being created. So let's just say, to use polite language, if the solution sounds like baloney, it probably is. Let's get refocused on practical steps that we can take more quickly, to build up the AI safety capabilities, the AI security capabilities that the government needs in Washington. Let's take the kind of steps that are going to advance job training more broadly. Let's do things that work, and let's innovate in new ways where we don't have things that work. This is a problem that needs 12 solutions that can be adopted more quickly, not one grandiose idea that we'll spend the next 30 years debating.
President Trump has raised the idea of the government getting a share of the big AI companies. Can you see that happening, and would Microsoft be in?
Well, look, we're not in the business of telling other people how to run their business, but we're not really interested in selling ourselves to any government. I think we have a very healthy capital structure as a company, as a private sector in the United States. I respect, any company that decides that it's the right decision for itself to take an equity stake from the government. Not here to say that they're making a mistake, but certainly at Microsoft, we're very comfortable where we are, and we respect and appreciate the leadership that we see in the government, including, especially, I would say, right now on AI security, out of the White House, out of the Treasury Department, across the administration. But we'd rather applaud than give some of our equity as the price of participating. Let me put it that way.
Brad Smith, we've been talking jobs as we say goodbye. Tell us about your first job.
Well, look, my first job really after clerking for a federal judge was in Washington, D.C. on 1201 Pennsylvania Avenue, walked into Covington and Burling. I had this great vision. They're going to send me overseas. I'm going to negotiate some international agreement. My first trip was to a file room. I was asked to read through 100,000 pages of documents. That was a lot back then. Use a tape recorder and record summaries. That got automated away 20 years ago. The good news is it was boring. and the even better news was when it got automated, people elevated themselves. I got to elevate myself. What I got to do was much more creative, much more fulfilling. That is easier to describe than make happen. But I think that is what we need to pursue. One job at a time, one employer at a time, one AI scenario at a time, and then magnify it across the economy.
And now you're Mr. President. Brad Smith, thank you for joining Axios Behind the Curtain.
Thank you.